So when we think about separation of church and state today, we're used to this mid-20th century model of American separationism, that mandatory prayer has been removed. There was a prayer written by the New York Board of Regents that was recited. Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence on Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. It was written to be ecumenical, right? There's no Jesus, there's no Lord. It's not in Hebrew. But in 1962, it was ruled unconstitutional because you were forcing kids to pray in the public school. And you were telling them how to pray. So eliminating prayer from school, eliminating mandatory Bible readings was done the next year in 1963. But when these happened, we have to remember the population was supportive of the status quo. 79% of people approved of prayer in school, like the New York Regents Board of Prayer. 70% opposed the elimination of Bible readings in public schools. So a lot of people wanted to keep it. But it was this shift to applying the Bill of Rights to the states that caused these changes. And these, by the way, these are not happening in Alabama or Mississippi. This is in New York, this is in Pennsylvania, this is in Illinois. And some parts of the South just never got the memo and didn't take these things, they refused to take these things out. And so when they talk about the separation of church and state is made up, well, they never experienced it because they ignored the rulings. Now, John F. Kennedy in 1960 was the first Catholic with a legitimate chance running for president. Al Smith ran in the 1920s, didn't get very far, but Kennedy had a chance to win. But there were a lot of people who were concerned that because he was Catholic, he was going to do whatever the Pope told him to do. Yeah, yeah, there was a lot of anti-papist sentiment, as he put it.
She said that he was going to make everybody eat spaghetti once a week.
Right, exactly.
Because the Pope wanted that.
Right. So he actually went to Houston and spoke to the Greater Houston Ministerial Association and gave a very strong affirmation of this separationist ideology. I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute, where no Catholic prelate would tell the president, should he be Catholic, how to act, and no Protestant minister would tell his parishioners for whom to vote. No church or church school is granted any public funds or political preference. No one is denied public office because his religion differs from the president who might appoint him or the people who might elect him. I believe in an America that is officially neither Catholic, Protestant, nor Jewish. No public official accepts requests or accepts instructions on public policy from any religious body. No religious body imposes its will on the general populace. And religious liberty is so indivisible that an act against one church is treated as an act against all. So a very strong affirmation of separation of religion and government, because people were worried he didn't believe in it. Because he was a Catholic, he was papist. I mean, if they'd known about his private behavior, they might have realized he wasn't so Catholic either. But that was a different era, right? Or maybe they knew about it and didn't care because they were doing the same thing. So this is an example of this ethos of this era, mid-20th century. And one of the most famous articulations of this was a later court case in 1971 called Lemon versus Kurzweil. It created what was called the Lemon test, which is not evaluating used cars. The Lemon test said that for a law concerning religion to work, it had to have a secular legislative purpose, so your purpose couldn't be to make people religious. That the principal or primary effect of it had to neither advance nor inhibit religion, so you couldn't ban religious practice, but you couldn't advance it either as its primary effect. And it shouldn't result in extensive government entanglement with religion. If you get too involved in what religions are doing, then that's creating a problem. That was the Lemon test that was in effect from 1971 until actually 2022, when a case came through that most scholars have said it effectively undoes the Lemon test, because the justices are no longer so worried about either a religious purpose or a religious effect or the entanglement issue. There was a case just recently where a big public cross on a public land was allowed to stay there despite lawsuits trying to remove it, because they said, what's the big deal? You know, your offense doesn't rise to the level of our intervening in this case. Where before,
where was the cross? I'm sorry, did you say where it was?
It's in Maryland, I think.
There's also a giant cross right on Interstate 70 in Illinois. It's like, 200 feet tall.
That, I think, technically is on private land.
That, I'm not sure if it's on private or public, but there's a couple, I've seen a couple, but they're gigantic crosses.
Right.
They might be in private land, you might be right.
So why was this case overturned? Why have things changed so much such that Kathy started by saying, is there separation of religion and government anymore? Well, in the 1990s, a new law was passed with almost universal support. Only 3 senators voted against it. It was called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act.
Yeah.
And the RFRA said that any kind of law that dealt with religion had to pass a strict scrutiny test, that it did not put a substantial burden on religious organizations. So basically, they got the default benefit of the doubt. And that allowed religions to do more and more activism and more reaching out into the public square, because any restrictions on them had to pass this strict scrutiny test that before was not as high of a bar. And sometimes it was reasonable. So, for example, there was a case in the 1980s of an officer in the Air Force who was an Orthodox Jew, but according to the manual of what soldiers were allowed to wear, he could not cover his head. You had to be bareheaded in the Air Force at all times, not just when you're, in your flight helmet. And so he was constantly written up for insubordination because he felt a religious duty to wear his kippah, and they said our secular purpose of unit cohesion requires you to take that thing off your head. And ultimately, I think he lost at the Supreme Court because they sided with the regulations of the Air Force, but that was one of the kind of cases that led to this act being passed because they felt that was an undue burden on him. Really, they could have modified the rules to let him wear his little kippah, and it wouldn't have changed unit cohesion. We had in the Bush era something called the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives, which was trying to create partnerships to allow faith-based organizations to do what secular nonprofits or government agencies had done in the past in terms of social services, and it was continued under Obama too. He did not end the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives. You had this big controversy 15 years ago over 10 Commandments monuments and putting up the 10 Commandments everywhere. Actually, these 10 Commandments monuments, many of them dated back to the 1940s, because the Fraternal Order of Eagles had begun to set these up in the 1940s. Again, notice the 1940s is when their separation states cases are coming in, and there's pushback by other organizations. But actually, a large chunk of these 10 Commandments monuments were paid for by Cecil B. DeMille. To promote the movie, exactly right. He partnered with the Fraternal Order of Eagles to get more of these out there, so more people would come see the movie. So it's not all, it's American capitalism. It's not all American religion. You also had issues of equal treatment. Are religions being treated equally to other nonprofits? Questions of discrimination, which we talked about. Beginning in the later 2000s, you began to have these debates about public symbols. We talked about churches on public land, but also the question of invocations. There was a famous case based out of Greece, New York, which is in Western New York, where this city council had invited exclusively fundamentalist Protestant clergy to do invocations at city council meetings every single time. And they were sued because they said, look, I'm not religious, and I'm not Protestant, I'm Jewish or secular, and I don't feel like I get a fair hearing here because you see me not standing to pray during the prayer. And so again, it was this, do you feel excluded or not? And ultimately what the Supreme Court said was, as long as they invite a wide variety of people to do it, all of the above is fine. This has really been a shift where it used to be none of the above, no religious things on public property, but now the understanding is once you create a public forum, you have to open it to everybody. So if you have a Christmas tree on your city hall lawn, then you also have to open it up to a menorah being there, and to a Festivus pole, and to a Satanist display, and so on. In fact, this happened in a sort of funny way in Washington State a few years ago. The Freedom from Religion Foundation applied for and was granted a spot for a December holiday display, along with a nativity scene and all these others, because they were part of the spectrum. And they put up a plaque that said, there is no God, there is no afterlife, enjoy your life and don't be afraid of hell, something like that. Someone stole that plaque off of its public display, and they found it in a ditch like 15 miles away. So they took that sign, they put it back up in its display, and added a sign that says, "Thou shalt not steal," on the plaque. But once it's a public square, it's all of the above. So now there are secular people who apply to be on the rotation of invocation givers at city council meetings because the Supreme Court said you have to include everybody. But it's a very different model than that none of the above approach that used to be more dominant and that secular people pushed for. So now we go the other direction, we push for all of the above, and if they're offended and they wanted to end the invocation program, we wouldn't object. You know, so you push the envelope and maybe they'll let it go. But we have to make different kind of arguments. When we were debating the question of gay marriage, I remember reading and signing on to an amicus brief that said, by not allowing gay marriage, you're restricting my religious freedom. Because my religious tradition would allow me to sanctify a same-sex partnership with the title of marriage. And if you're not allowing that to be the case legally, and for me to use that language, then you are infringing on my religious freedom to do so. If a Catholic priest doesn't want to do it, that's fine, they don't have to do it. But not allowing me to do it is restricting my religious freedom. That wasn't the deciding factor in these cases, but it was an interesting argument. You're now seeing this in abortion law cases, right? So in Missouri, for example, a coalition of liberal religious people, including rabbis, are saying that their religious tradition empowers people to have a pro-choice approach to the issue of abortion.
Florida also, there's
and Florida's another case there too, right?
Case there.
And they're trying to use that religious freedom argument to support a more liberal perspective because that's the jurisprudence on separation of religion and government. You could make a secular argument, why not to have these laws? But people are actually trying to make the religious argument because part of their point is that by defining a child as a full human being at conception, that's a religious dogma, that's a religious statement. You're imposing, you're establishing one religious definition, which again, you shouldn't be allowed to do. So will it make a difference? I don't know. What I think will make a difference though, is we are pushing the envelope on John Locke's carve out. Remember Locke said, believe in any God you want, as long as you believe in a God. Eisenhower, by the way, said the same thing in the 1950s, because the communist Soviet empire was the atheist empire, and we were the religious country, and 95% of Americans believed in God. Well, that isn't the case anymore. Because as we get a larger and larger secularized population, that might change this calculus of how we argue these issues and what separation of religion and government really means. If you're choosing no favorite among many religions, that's the old approach. But if you have a larger secular population, it might change the discussion. So you look at countries like the United Kingdom, where they have an established church. People still have to pay taxes for it, and they hate it. Nobody goes.
It's like 6% of the population.
A very small percentage are identified with it.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's a number of countries that have a majority of the population who say they don't believe in a God. So I saw an article just this past week by Phil Zuckerman, who's a scholar of secularism, and he wrote an article called The Secular Seven, about 7 democracies that have a majority or much greater that say they do not believe in a God. When asked in a survey, they say no. So what countries would you guess would be on that list of a majority or more of the population says they do not believe in a God? Okay.
France.
Scandinavia?
The Scandinavian countries, maybe?
I would say probably the Netherlands.
The Netherlands, okay.
Where did we see those
Canada,
countries that were
maybe?
turned
I don't
into
know.
theaters and
Maybe
stuff?
Canada?
Sort of
Was that in
average.
Germany?
That was in,
Moderate.
no, that was actually in Amsterdam.
That was in
Yeah.
Amsterdam.
Yeah,
Okay.
the new church was the new church in
All right, so
Denmark.
let's see what we got.
Switzerland, I think.
Number 1 is Sweden,
Yeah, Sweden.
over 60%.
Denmark.
The Czech Republic.
That's a little surprising.
Now there is a
No,
history.
they were communists. So-
Well,
Yeah,
that's
so
true.
the
Yeah,
communist
that's
influence
true.
is one. Also remember Unitarianism started in the Czech Republic. There's
Oh, did it?
a long
Oh,
history of sort of heretical
Well,
thought
Jan
there.
Hus was from that
Yeah,
area.
that's
That was the
true. He
first of the
was,
sort of Protestant reformers.
Right. South Korea,
South Korea.
Interesting.
very advanced science educational
Yeah.
society, right? Netherlands, as we thought. Estonia, another former Soviet
Yeah.
territory where that part of the Soviet stuff stuck. Norway against Scandinavia, and the UK at 51%. Now he also points out that there are some that are just barely under the, the threshold. Almost half doesn't believe in God in
Yeah,
France,
France,
Denmark,
yeah.
Australia, New Zealand, and in Finland. And in those societies, the conversation about the separation of religion and government is very different. Australia, for example, has elected an atheist prime minister. So has France. So this is a very different world. When you ask Americans, would you vote for an atheist for president, it's still under 50%.
Oh, yeah, way
I
under.
always thought it'd be the
Atheist, I
last.
think, slightly beats Muslim as someone who people are willing to vote for, sadly. But it's still a very low number. On the other hand, if you look at American religious beliefs, we'll see that the tide is shifting here too. I see a
Yeah.
note in the chat here.
The no's are.
Why do they say under God in the Pledge of Allegiance at the start of government meetings? Well, as it turns out, the original Pledge of Allegiance didn't have under God in
No,
it.
they added
Right,
that.
They added that in the
When I was
19
first
In the
grade.
1950s.
in the 1950s as part of this anti-Soviet atheism messaging. Let's add under God to the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, in God we trust on the money, that goes back to the Civil War, so that's not as recent. But notice also, remember the Civil War is also when that constitutional amendment was proposed to add Christ to the Constitution. But if you look at the American religious belief system, you'll notice that we're not as secular as those other places. So if you add up believe in God absolutely certain and believe in God fairly certain, I can even make this a little bigger.
Yeah, thank you.
Because I couldn't read it.
Yeah. That's still 83%, right? And it's only about 9% who do not believe in God or don't know, right? So it's still a much higher numbers say yes than no.
This is reasonably current.
Yeah, this is from the Pew Forum sample
That's all right, I
size. Yeah, I think it's been in the last few years. They do this every few years. Now, this is fascinating. They ask people by religious group they identify with whether they believe in God or not. You think it'll be 100%, but no. Look at how many Buddhists say they do not believe in a God. 27% of Buddhists say, no, they don't believe in a God. Now, 64% of Catholics believe, and another 27% are fairly certain. So that's, what is that, 80, 91%?
It'd be hard to be Catholic, I think, and be an atheist.
Right, same thing for evangelical Protestant, right? 98% believe or are pretty sure. Hindus, interesting, 10% say no. Black Protestants, again, very high numbers. That's like 98%, even more so, almost equivalent to the evangelicals. Jehovah's Witnesses, again, very, look at the Jews.
Yeah, we're very secular.
Only 37% are absolutely sure. And then, not at all certain, 14%, and do not believe, 17%. So, we have much more doubt out there. You notice, again, Mormons very high, Muslims very high. The unaffiliated, the religious nuns, 27% of them do believe in a God for sure, and another 22% are pretty certain. So about half of the nuns believe in some kind of a God, but again, 33% do not believe in a God. Now where that becomes important is when you look at generationally. So if you look at the cohort by age, the do not know if they believe, 18 to 29 is substantial, but if you go to do not believe in a God, 38% of them are 18 to 29. And another 34% are 30 to 49. So the older cohort is much less likely to say they don't believe in a God, and much more likely to say they do believe in a God. So the older ones here, if you look at this chart, it's more represented that way. And same thing if you look at the generational breakout, 26% of younger millennials do not believe in a God. That's a very high number compared to the fairly certain, only 15%. So this gives you a feel, also gender breakdown. Men and women are more men are more likely to be atheists than women, as it works out. Again, 2/3 to 1/3 in that category. But the believe in God absolutely certain, again, women are the majority for that category. Racial and ethnic composition. The do not believe in a God, 77% of those are white, and a much smaller number are black or Asian. Whereas the absolutely certain, again, largely white, but that's where you get a higher number of these other ethnic minorities. Immigration status, again, as you can imagine, those more recently immigrated are more likely to believe. And income distribution, okay, so there's all kinds of data you can break out with. The point is that younger Americans tend to be more secular, and that, I think, will change the dynamic of separation of religion and government. I mean, ultimately, the pushback we're seeing now in the last 20 years is probably a reaction against this secularization process. they see they're losing. And so they push back as much as possible to try to establish as much as possible to get as far as they can, because they see that the society is changing and not the way they want it to. The question is, do you just simply accommodate to that, or do you find ways to try to push back and evangelize and make the society more religious, created in your image? Which in many ways is anathema to what John Locke and Spinoza wrote about. You know, the idea was you make up your own mind and you tolerate other people to make up their own mind. Forcing your religion on them, forcing them to support your religion is exactly what they warned against. And the fault lines of our American Civil War / divorce are on politics and guns and abortion rights, but they're also on religion and religious practice and the vision of America that you see. When Lauren Boebert says, I don't see anything wrong with calling it a Christian nation. You know, I'm a Christian nationalist, she says. She sees nothing wrong with God and country being simultaneous. Those of us out here who are secular and or Jewish and or liberal, we have a big issue with that. But we've been on the losing side of some of these issues because we're winning on the culture side. We've got gay marriage. For many years we had legal abortion. And so this is the pushback against those cultural victories.
Do you think the commonly used word of communist, whatever, in attacks politically is really at least somewhat or maybe more so based in religious threat than it is the political means of communism?
Well, it's name calling, right?
Yeah, well,
Just like we call them fascists.
I think it's just labeling. I mean,
Well,
it
is
implies
labeling.
a whole lot of things. I mean, atheist is part of it, but it's also the government owns all the, I mean, a lot of it's
I've
economic.
always
and
taken
it's-
it as political. I didn't think about it as religious until this.
But it's also culturally subversive.
Yeah.
You want to undermine all that is right and true and obvious
Right.
in society. So gender roles and gender identities and traditional marriage and public affirmations of faith and like they go down the list of all these things. And if you say you're opposed to all the old versions of those things, then you're an underminer of society.
Which means you're a communist.
Which means, right, so they see that as communist equals the opposite of what we are, and therefore you are beyond the pale. And so the religion is part of it, but I think in the broader picture, it's you are undermining the basis of society. Remember, John Adams in 1780 was writing that religion is the basis of a moral and functioning society, and so we need to publicly promote it. And so that's what these people are trying to do from a similar perspective.
There was tension even then because if you look between Jefferson and Adams, and Jefferson's a deist and very much an Enlightenment person, and Adams really isn't. Adams is still kind of an old school Protestant, Massachusetts, a Puritan background. I mean, his wife is Abigail's the daughter of a minister. And he had to be brought up kind of a little short when he went to Philadelphia for the Continental Congress and made critical comments about, Quakers. And then he was corrected that, we don't hang Quakers in this town like you used to. So, he was not the most enlightened person in many ways.
Yeah.
I like John Adams, by the way.
And Patrick Henry was a very religiously active and evangelical person.
Yeah,
and
very much so. Whereas
yeah.
Washington never stepped first,
Right. So the founders are really a mixed bag when it comes to religion.
And they show the tension, I think, in the documents.
And part of our challenge is not to project our ideals back.
Right.
And either assume they were always like us or they were the opposite of us. And that's the problem that the religious right does also. They look back and they make their history, which is a skewed version in their own way. They have to deny the fact that there was a treaty signed by John Adams that said the United States is in no way founded on the Christian religion. That's a line in the Treaty of Tripoli. But on the other hand, there are other sources that do affirm some kind of hiring chaplains and other rhetoric that's used by other presidents. So this is our mixed inheritance, and we who believe in a living constitution that admits of interpretation have to impose our values on it and not be apologetic that we think these are the right values for a diverse society, and that's helped us be successful in accommodating diverse opinions over the last decades. All right, any last comments, questions?
Well, one thing you didn't get into, which I think is important, is.
I've already talked for an hour.
Yeah, I know. But I think, in terms of current trends, if you're looking at the Hobby Lobby and, case, and the thing that the Supreme Court has opened the door to is allowing people to discriminate on the basis of religion. And I think it's very important because they're going back to, we don't want blacks, we don't want Catholics, we don't want the Irish. Well, my religion says I don't have to serve black people, or gay people,
The
or
whole
whatever. And
wedding cake business?
Yeah.
right,
But
and
it's
we've
not
gotten away from the idea that if you're in the public sector as a businessman, you have to serve everybody equally. And now they're saying, well, no, you can do
Public accommodation.
now you can
Right.
do what you want because it's against your religion, and you don't have to do this. And that's really damaging secular society.
Well, I mean, I could push the envelope the other way. If somebody wanted you to make a KKK cake, should you have to do that?
On the basis of what I'm saying, yes. Because I mean.
So a Jewish kosher bakery, and somebody walk in and say, I want you to make a KKK cake.
Well, it's a problem of the price of business, but the freedoms that we allow people means that you have to allow freedoms for people you don't agree with.
There was a case in, I think it was South Carolina, again, where,
It's always South Carolina.
no, not always, but an evangelical, adoption agency, denied a Jewish couple.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah.
This is a straight Jewish couple, not even a
Yeah.
gay Jewish couple. Because they said, we place children with Christ-fearing homes, and that's what we do. And now, there are a lot of Catholic hospitals out there.
Yeah.
Catholic hospitals will not do any permanent contraception, tube tying, vasectomies, etc., because it's against their doctrine. Should we force them to close? Well, that's going to
It's
undermine public health
yeah, it is.
services.
Yeah, it's a real problem. I mean, there's no easy solution.
If they're receiving Medicare funding and other government funding, do they have to offer the full suite of medical procedures? Well,
I did
That's a
my
tough-
gynae in a Catholic hospital in a physician,
mhm.
and, I mean, a long time ago, but 40-something years, but, it was known that I was gonna get a limited education. The cafeteria was very good, free lunch, but the education was gonna be limited, and it was not challenged, it wasn't questioned.
Right, right. So, this is one of those, it's tricky. Like a lot of these produce conflicts of right versus right. And, you're gonna hurt someone either way. And there's no easy answers to this.
No easy answer.
So sometimes we have to live in the uncertainty. There's actually a really interesting book by a conservative legal scholar named Stephen Carter called A Culture of Disbelief, where he talks about some of these church-state issues and how it makes religious people feel limited in their exercise of their rights and their free practice. He talks about that, the yarmulke wearer at the Air Force Academy is one example. Maybe he's drawing it out a little bit to his side, but there are cases where the religious freedom argument is compelling. And we have to be subtle enough and not tribal enough that we can try to find an equitable solution while still respecting basic rights of the minorities.